Used to it in LA. Hollywood, the scenery of parties and stuff like that. You get introduced to all the drugs and stuff, and I end up in all the wrong places. Let me just say this, going LA was home for me, and it was never anything. First wife and second wife. I never abused my kids because I love my kids because I was abused, but I became an alcoholic. I became a drug addict. The drugs consumed me. I ended up taking amphetamines, playing baseball. I wasn't always like this. There was a time I was a heathen, I was a liar, a cheater, womanizer, alcoholic, drug addict, sinner, saved by grace.
Finally revealed, the shocking truth about Darryl Strawberry and the time he spent in jail. A former superstar athlete drafted first overall in 1980, a New York icon, a baseball legend. But behind the glory was a nightmare nobody wanted to expose. Today, he calls himself a minister and talks about redemption. His wife Tracy is fighting cancer. The world sees his redemption. But the facts tell a different story entirely. The domestic violence allegations, the drug crimes, the sex addiction that destroyed his marriages, the crimes that landed him in prison, and the secrets nobody has ever heard. If this incredible story hits you hard, smash that hype button right now and give it all the support it deserves. Here's the complete account of what really happened. When Darryl Strawberry was drafted first overall in 1980, he was not just a baseball prospect, he was a cultural sensation. New York City in the early 1980s was defined by excess, money, fame, parties, and young athletes like Strawberry found themselves completely insulated from real consequences. The media protected them. The front offices looked the other way. Fans made excuses. Nobody wanted to believe that their hero could be flawed. Nobody wanted to accept that the guy hitting home runs was also breaking his wife's nose at home. That disconnect between the public image and the private reality is where the entire tragedy begins. This was a unique era in professional sports. The 1980s did not have the scrutiny that exists today. There was no social media. There were no cameras everywhere. There was no accountability structure for star athletes. A player could be arrested on a Friday and back on the field on Monday with a quick statement from his agent. Sports journalists were not in the business of investigating the personal lives of players. They were in the business of selling tickets and airtime. And the biggest stars in the biggest markets got the most protection. Strawberry was in New York. New York in the 1980s was a city obsessed with winning, with excellence, with star power. Strawberry was young. Strawberry was talented. Strawberry was everything the franchise needed to succeed. He was a generational talent, a once-in-a-decade athlete. So the system protected him. The organization protected him. The media protected him. And the culture of professional baseball protected him. Because losing him, having something happen to derail his career, that was unthinkable. That was a threat to the entire business model. So the unofficial message to Strawberry was clear. Do what you need to do, but do not get caught. Or if you do get caught, we will handle it. Strawberry married Lisa Andrews in January of 1985. By then, he was the hottest thing in baseball. The New York Mets had their savior. Newspapers called him the Black Ted Williams. The comparison was meant as the highest compliment. He was young, talented, and surrounded by enablers who made sure he never faced actual accountability for anything. He had agents. He had advisors. He had team officials. He had everyone telling him that he was special, that the rules did not apply to him, that his talent excused his behavior. Lisa Andrews was pulled into a marriage with a man who was already deep in substance abuse and behavioral patterns that nobody was treating. Nobody was intervening. Nobody was saying that this was a problem that needed to be addressed. They had a child together. On the surface, it looked like the perfect sports family. Magazine covers, endorsements, the whole package. The narrative of the young superstar building a family. But the marriage was falling apart almost immediately. Behind closed doors, behind the magazine covers and the endorsement deals, something darker was happening. In October of 1986, something happened behind closed doors. Darryl and Lisa had a violent altercation. According to police reports and later accounts, Darryl struck Lisa in the face with enough force to break her nose. This was not a minor argument. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a man using his strength and anger against his spouse. Lisa filed for legal separation that same month. What is remarkable and deeply troubling is the timing. The New York Mets were in the middle of a historic World Series championship run. The media was celebrating. The city was obsessed with Strawberry's performance on the field, and the domestic violence allegation was barely a blip, a small article buried in back pages. The sports press did not want to spoil the narrative. The World Series was too important. The team was too loved. so the broken nose allegation was quietly contained. It did not generate the kind of sustained media attention that would occur in later decades. It did not trigger investigations. It did not lead to criminal charges. It was managed, contained, minimized, and Strawberry and Lisa reconciled shortly after. They stayed together. But the damage was done. The pattern had begun, and the signal sent to Strawberry was unmistakable, that he could strike his wife and face no real consequences. By 1989, the marriage was crumbling in a more public way. Lisa filed for divorce. But the trigger was not just the violence or the emotional abuse. Darryl had fathered a child with another woman named Lisa Clayton. Blood tests confirmed it. This was not a rumor. This was biological proof that Strawberry had been unfaithful. And it was not a one-time mistake. It was part of a much larger problem. Even as he was supposed to be building a life with Lisa Andrews, he was engaging in multiple relationships and leaving a trail of women and children behind. Lisa Andrews felt the humiliation completely. She had stood by him through the broken nose incident. She had reconciled. She had tried to make the marriage work. And now she was learning that he had fathered a child with someone else. The divorce process began in earnest. It would not be finalized until 1993. But the marriage was effectively dead. Then came January of 1990. Police were called to the Strawberry home. What happened there was far more dangerous than the broken nose incident. According to the police report and later biographical accounts, there was a violent altercation between Darryl and Lisa. During this altercation, Darryl allegedly struck her. But more terrifying than the physical blow was what came next. He allegedly threatened her with a gun. Not just any gun. A .25 caliber pistol. Imagine being in your own home with a man you married and having him pull a weapon on you. Imagine the fear, the sense of complete violation. Imagine knowing that at any moment your life could be over. This was not just domestic violence. This was a credible threat using a deadly weapon. This was assault with a deadly weapon. This was the kind of crime that sends people to prison for years, but here is where the system failed. Completely and totally. Rather than face charges for assault with a deadly weapon, Strawberry was offered a deal. The charges would be dropped if he entered a rehabilitation center for alcohol abuse. This became known as a rehab for freedom dynamic, clinical treatment in exchange for avoiding criminal accountability. The message it sent was clear. If you are a famous athlete and you commit violence against your wife, you do not have to go to prison. You just have to go to rehab. You check in, you attend some group sessions, you leave, and your record is clean. The underlying issues that caused the violence, the addiction that fueled it, the rage that powered it, none of that was truly addressed. He got treatment that he could have received at any time if he had chosen it, but instead it was used as a get-out-of-jail card. And in the wider culture, the message was not that violence against women was serious. The message was that violence against women could be managed with the right PR and the right legal strategy. It was a failure of the criminal justice system. A failure to protect a woman from a violent man. A failure that would have consequences for decades to come as Strawberry continued to engage in violent behavior with the next woman who came into his life. The marriage to Lisa Andrews finally ended in 1993. 13 years after they met, 13 years of escalating incidents, 13 years of infidelity, 13 years of substance abuse, 13 years of broken trust. When the divorce was finalized, Lisa Andrews walked away with her dignity and her life. She had survived a man who had broken her nose and threatened her with a gun. She had survived infidelity and humiliation. She had raised their child, and she had gotten out. What happened next would show that Strawberry had learned nothing from the experience. In September of 1993, just months before his divorce from Lisa was finalized, Darryl Strawberry was arrested for domestic abuse. But this time, it was not against Lisa Andrews. It was against a new woman named Charisse Simons. The charges alleged that he had assaulted her. But Charisse Simons did what Lisa Andrews did. She dropped the charges. She reconciled. She stayed in the relationship. And 3 months later, in December of 1993, Strawberry married her. This is a crucial pattern to understand. This is the cycle that defines his intimate relationships. Violence, reconciliation, marriage. And then the cycle begins again with the same dynamics. This is not a one-time mistake. This is not a man having one bad moment that he learned from. This is a cycle. This is a man who engages in violent behavior and then marries the woman he assaulted. And then the cycle begins again with the next woman. This is what addiction and untreated trauma and a sense of entitlement produces. This is a pattern that repeats and repeats and repeats until it destroys everything in its path. It destroys the women involved. It destroys the children who witness it. It destroys trust. It destroys the ability to have a healthy relationship. The marriage to Carice Simons lasted longer than the marriage to Lisa Andrews, 13 years instead of 8, but it was marked by the exact same destructive patterns. The same infidelity, the same substance abuse, the same complete lack of impulse control, the same cycle of violence and reconciliation. However, Carice got a very different kind of exposure into the depths of Strawberry's behavior. In 1998, Strawberry was diagnosed with colon cancer. This was a life-threatening illness that forced both of them to confront mortality. Carice became his primary caretaker. She nursed him through surgery. She attended medical appointments. She stayed by his side through recovery. She supported him emotionally and physically. She was there when he was at his most vulnerable. She was there when he needed her most. But even as she was caring for him through cancer, there was another issue that Carice was aware of, an issue that was far more destructive than anything cancer could do to a marriage. Strawberry had a compulsive need for sexual validation that overrode every other consideration in his life. This is not just cheating. This is not just infidelity. This is a psychological problem that manifests as compulsive sexual behavior, regardless of consequences or commitments or the pain it causes to the people who love him. Years later, Strawberry and Carice co-authored a book called Recovering Life. In this book, they revealed the shocking extent of his sexual compulsion. He admitted that he had sex during Major League Baseball games. Not before games, not after games, not at home, during games, while his teammates were on the field playing, while the game was happening, while thousands of fans were in the stands. He was in the clubhouse having sexual encounters with women. But how did the women get there? How did he facilitate these encounters? Strawberry had figured out a system, a calculated, organized, ongoing system designed to facilitate infidelity on a massive scale. He would identify women in the stands at Shea Stadium during games. Then he would have clubhouse attendants, workers employed by the team, go into the stands and approach these women. The attendants would tell the women that Strawberry wanted to meet them. The attendants would bring them back to the private areas of the clubhouse, where Strawberry would be waiting between innings. And then they would have sexual encounters, repeatedly, during games. This is not a spontaneous mistake. This is not a moment of weakness. This is a calculated system designed to facilitate infidelity on a massive scale. And it shows a level of entitlement and manipulation that is almost impossible to comprehend. He used his power and his status to manipulate women. He corrupted team employees into facilitating his behavior. He completely disrespected his wife and his marriage and the sport itself. He treated the clubhouse like it was his personal playground for infidelity. He treated women like they were objects for his use. He treated the team resources as his personal property, and nobody in the organization stopped him. Nobody told him this was unacceptable. Carice stayed with him even after this was revealed. She stayed with him when he went to prison. From 1997 to 1998, Strawberry had a cancer diagnosis that terrified him and required major surgery. Carice was there. But she was not just dealing with cancer. She was dealing with the knowledge that her husband was compulsively unfaithful, that he was using team resources to facilitate his infidelity, that he was manipulating women, that he was lying to her constantly. And when his drug problem got worse, when the legal system started catching up with him, Carice had to witness all of it. By 2006, the marriage was over. Strawberry had gone to prison. He had relapsed on drugs multiple times. He had been unfaithful repeatedly. The financial burden of his legal problems was crushing, and Carice had simply endured enough. The divorce was finalized in 2006. But before we get to the end of the marriages, we have to understand what was happening in the legal system. Because there was a crime that Strawberry committed in the early 1990s that would have consequences that lasted for decades, that crime would eventually lead to him being sent to prison. And that crime was tax evasion. While the public was obsessed with stories about his drug use and his violence, a much more methodical crime was building in the background. A crime that tracked the actual money he was making and not reporting. A crime that the federal government took very seriously. In 1994, federal investigators were looking at Strawberry's financial records. What they found was a pattern of unreported income. Strawberry had been earning money from autographs and memorabilia. This was a common way for athletes to make supplementary income in that era. He would go to card shows, he would go to sports memorabilia events, he would sign items for fans, and he would be paid in cash. Hundreds of dollars here, thousands of dollars there. Brown paper bags full of money. It was the cash economy of sports. It was common. It was easy. And it was completely off the books. And none of it was reported to the Internal Revenue Service. Between 1986 and 1990, he failed to report approximately $350,000 in income from this cash economy. $350,000 in unreported income. That is not a small amount. That is a massive amount of money earned and not reported. That is deliberate tax evasion. That is a federal crime. The federal government takes tax evasion very seriously. It is not a victimless crime. It shifts the tax burden to ordinary citizens. It undermines the integrity of the tax system. It is a calculation that says, I will not pay my fair share. The indictment was filed in 1994. On April 24th of 1995, Strawberry pleaded guilty to income tax evasion. The United States District Court for the Southern District of New York accepted his plea. He was sentenced to 3 years of probation. He was ordered to serve 6 months of home confinement. He was required to do 100 hours of community service, and he was required to pay restitution for the back taxes and all the penalties. This was a federal felony conviction, a felony. This meant that Strawberry lost certain civil rights. This meant that any future legal problem would be treated much more seriously because he was now a convicted federal felon. He was on probation, he was monitored, and any violation of that probation could send him to prison. But Strawberry did not stop breaking the law. He did not use this as a wake-up call. He did not make changes. Instead, he continued his addiction and his risky behavior. And on April 14th of 1999, everything came crashing down in a way that destroyed his baseball career permanently. Strawberry was in Tampa, Florida. He was supposed to be in a rehabilitation and training program with the New York Yankees. He was supposed to be getting clean. He was supposed to be making a comeback. He was supposed to be turning his life around. But instead of staying focused on recovery, instead of taking his probation seriously, he was driving around the city at night, and he saw a woman on the street. He approached her, and he offered her $50 in exchange for sex. The woman was not a prostitute. She was not in the life. She was an undercover police officer working a vice sting operation. When Strawberry approached her and made the solicitation, he exposed himself to immediate arrest. He had violated the law. When police searched him after his arrest, they found something even more damaging than the solicitation charge. In his wallet, wrapped inside a $20 bill, was 0.3 grams of cocaine. Strawberry claimed the cocaine was not his. He claimed the solicitation was a joke. He said he was just joking around. He said it was not serious. None of these explanations helped him. None of these stories changed the legal reality. Major League Baseball suspended him for 140 days. But much more importantly, he had violated his probation from the 1995 tax evasion case. He was a convicted federal felon on probation. He had been arrested for soliciting sex. He was found with cocaine. His probation officer was not going to accept excuses. His probation officer was not going to believe that it was a joke. Strawberry was a known drug user. Strawberry was on federal probation, and now he had been arrested for solicitation and possessed a controlled substance. This was a direct and serious violation of his probation conditions. What followed was a chain reaction of legal consequences that had been inevitable from the moment he did not take his first probation seriously. Court dates, probation hearings, more charges, more violations. The system was closing in. Each violation compounded the next. Each mistake multiplied the consequences. By 2002, Strawberry was back in the prison system. He served an 11-month sentence in a Florida state prison. An 11-month sentence. Not a weekend, not a few months. Not something he could breeze through. 11 months locked up, behind bars, separated from his family, missing his son, missing his life on the outside. Missing everything, missing his wife, missing his career, missing the ability to make a living, missing freedom itself. This was the inevitable end of the path he had chosen. Years of violence, years of infidelity, years of drug abuse, years of tax evasion, years of soliciting prostitutes, years of possessing cocaine, years of refusing to get real help, years of treating probation like a game he could play, and finally prison. Real consequences, real time served in a real cell. He was released from prison, and for many years Strawberry fell out of the public eye. He was no longer a superstar. He was no longer in the headlines. He was a forgotten former athlete, a cautionary tale, a man whose career had been completely derailed by his own destructive choices and actions. But something unexpected and genuinely remarkable happened in the years after his release from prison. Strawberry genuinely tried to change. He did not just talk about changing, he actually did the work. He got clean from drugs, he attended recovery programs and support groups, He got into recovery in a serious way. He got married again in 2006 to a woman named Tracy who believed in him, and together with Tracy, he built something meaningful. They started a ministry called Finding Your Way, a ministry focused specifically on helping people recover from addiction. Strawberry used his own terrible story as a tool to help others find their way. And for many years it worked. He was doing the work. He was helping people. He was telling his story honestly without minimizing or making excuses. And the cycle seemed to have finally broken. Then came the events of late 2025. In November of 2025, nearly 30 years after his initial tax evasion conviction in 1995, something remarkable and unexpected happened. President Donald Trump issued a presidential pardon. This was not a pardon for the drug crimes. This was not a pardon for the solicitation. This was not a pardon for any of his criminal activity after 1995. This was specifically and explicitly a pardon for the income tax evasion conviction from April 24th of 1995. Darryl Strawberry had been officially pardoned. The federal felony conviction was erased from his record. The record was wiped clean. It was as if the conviction had never happened in the eyes of the law. Strawberry revealed details of how he found out about the pardon. He described receiving a phone call. An operator said words that he had never expected to hear. "Darryl Strawberry, you have a call from the President of the United States." President Trump was on the line. This was not an email. This was not a letter. This was a direct phone call from the most powerful person in the country. Trump was on the line. Trump reminisced about watching Strawberry play baseball in the 1980s. Trump talked about his dominance at the plate. Trump talked about his talent and his athleticism. Trump talked about how great Strawberry was when he was in his prime. Trump had watched him play. Trump remembered him. Trump had paid attention. And then Trump told him that he had signed an executive order granting him a full and unconditional pardon. The 1995 conviction was gone. The felony was erased. The legal record was wiped clean. It was like those 30 years of carrying the weight of that conviction were finally over. It was like a burden he had carried for 3 decades was finally lifted. On November 24th of 2025, Strawberry was speaking at Sheridan Church in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He gave a sermon about what the pardon meant to him. He said words that resonated with his faith community. He said that God had set him completely free through the pardon from President Trump. God setting him free. This was not just a legal victory. This was a spiritual moment for him. The pardon became more than a legal document. It became a symbol of divine forgiveness, and it positioned Strawberry within a particular political and cultural context. The evangelical conservative movement embraced the pardon narrative. A fallen man redeemed, a criminal made clean, a sinner forgiven by God through the vehicle of a presidential pardon. But just as Strawberry seemed to be reaching a place of peace, a place where he could finally put the past behind him, something far more serious threatened everything that he and Tracy had built. Something that no pardon could fix. Something that no sermon could solve. Something that would force him to become not the person talking about his own recovery, but the person standing beside his wife as she fought for her life. In the summer of 2025, Darryl announced that Tracy had been diagnosed with early-stage cancer. Tracy, who had stood by him when he was in prison. Tracy, who had helped him get clean and stay clean. Tracy, who had built a ministry with him. Tracy was now the one who was sick. Tracy was now the one who needed care. The roles were reversing in the most painful way possible. For years, Darryl had been the person being cared for, the person in recovery, the person fighting demons, the person being supported by his spouse. Now he had to be the caregiver. Now he had to be the one showing up every single day for someone he loved who was fighting a disease that could take her away from him. This was the ultimate test of his transformation. This was the moment that revealed whether the ministry and the redemption narrative were real or just words. The treatment protocol was not simple. In October of 2025, Tracy underwent back-to-back surgeries. These were not minor procedures. One of these surgeries was a hip replacement on top of cancer treatment. Imagine having to recover from surgery for cancer at the same time you are recovering from a hip replacement. Imagine the pain. Imagine the weakness. Imagine trying to rebuild your body when it has been attacked from multiple directions at once. Darryl was with her through all of it. But recovery is never a straight line. Recovery is not a process that follows a predictable path. On October 23rd of 2025, Darryl posted an update from the hospital. Tracy had experienced a setback. The clinical details were not shared publicly. Darryl did not go into specifics about what the setback meant or how serious it was, but the tone of the message made it crystal clear that the situation was serious. He asked for prayers. He asked for support and intercession. He was scared. For a man who had spent decades talking about his own recovery and redemption, he was now in the position of watching someone he loved fight for her life and being completely unable to control the outcome. Could not fix it. He could not prevent it. He could not manage it. He could only stand beside her and pray. By November of 2025, the situation had stabilized. The critical period had passed. Darryl shared a major milestone with the world. Tracy was finally strong enough to leave the house for the first time in 3 weeks. 3 weeks. 21 days inside. 21 days of recovery, of pain management, of physical weakness and emotional fear, of wondering if she would make it through. And then finally, she was strong enough and well enough to go outside. Where did they go? They visited their lake house. A renovation project was underway, a new basement, a new front addition, new construction, new building. Darryl described it as a metaphor for their own rebuilding. Out of destruction, construction. Out of illness, recovery. Out of pain, moving forward. Out of darkness, light. By January of 2026, just a few weeks ago, Tracy was returning to public life in meaningful ways. Darryl was appearing in interviews with his wife, talking about what it means to navigate faith during medical trauma, talking about what it means to support someone you love when they are fighting for their health and life, talking about resilience and strength. This is where Darryl Strawberry finds himself today, not as the superstar, not as the convicted felon, not as the man in prison, but as a husband standing beside a woman he loves as she fights for her life. And that is perhaps the most important redemption of all. The story of Darryl Strawberry is a story about consequences. It is a story about how actions echo forward through decades and years and across the lives of many people. It is a story about domestic violence and how it is enabled by systems that protect powerful men from accountability. It is a story about drug addiction and how it destroys not just the person using, but everyone around them and everyone connected to them. It is a story about greed and tax evasion and the choices we make when we think we can get away with things. It is a story about a man who caused tremendous harm, who hurt people deeply, who broke laws, who spent time in prison. But it is also a story about what comes after prison, about whether redemption is possible, about whether a person can genuinely change their nature, about whether faith and recovery can be real and authentic and transformative. Darryl Strawberry did not deserve the pardon because the past disappeared. The broken nose that he allegedly gave Lisa Andrews did not heal because of a pardon. It still happened. The trauma she experienced did not disappear. The child that Lisa Clayton had to raise without his support, the emotional damage of that, the financial burden of that does not disappear. The trauma that his wives experienced, that does not disappear. The women that he manipulated, the infidelity, the dishonesty, none of that gets erased by being forgiven. Redemption is not about erasing the past. Redemption is not about pretending that the bad things never happened. Redemption is not about getting a pardon and saying that everything is fine now. Redemption is about genuinely changing and doing the work to be different. Redemption is about facing your victims and acknowledging what you did. Redemption is about becoming a different person at your core. Darryl Strawberry seems to have done that work. He got clean from drugs. He stayed clean. He got married to someone who believed in him and who he could be trusted with. He built a ministry that helps other people find their way out of addiction. He told his story honestly without minimizing or making excuses. And now he is supporting his wife through the most difficult period of her life. He is showing up. He is present. He is a caregiver and a partner. The real test of redemption is not whether you get pardoned by a president. It is not whether your conviction is erased from the federal record. The real test of redemption is whether you become a fundamentally different person. It is whether you use your second chance to actually help people instead of hurting them. It is whether you face your past with honesty and accountability instead of denial and excuses. It is whether you can look the people you hurt in the eye and acknowledge the damage you caused without asking for forgiveness or understanding in return. And in the years since his release from prison, Darryl Strawberry appears to have done exactly that. He has become the kind of person who can support his wife through cancer. He has become the kind of person who can minister to others about recovery and faith. He has become the kind of person who can sit with his past without being destroyed by it. He has become the kind of person who can acknowledge his mistakes without making excuses. Whether that is enough, whether that balances the scales of all the harm he caused, that is something only his victims and his God can decide. That is not our judgment to make. But what is clear is that his story is not over. His life is not over, and neither is his wife's fight. Make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this one. And in the comments below, tell us what you think about Darryl Strawberry's journey and whether you believe redemption is real and possible.